Okay, let's go.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Learning GRC in 12 weeks series with me, Priyanka Chatterjee. And I cannot believe it's already week 4. In week 4, we're going to learn about compliance management. So before we start, as always, let's do a quick recap of what we learned in week 3, where we learned about risk management. So what's risk management? It's about identifying, assessing, and mitigating threats to an acceptable level being the key. Now, risks can be mitigated using a balance of people, process, and technology. And we need to make sure that we have built a mechanism of ongoing monitoring and updates to our overall risk management practice. Now, before we start into and deep diving into week 4, if you have not already subscribed to my channel, please take the moment to do so now. And without further ado, let's get started with week 4, Introduction to Cybersecurity Compliance Management. This week's goal is about understanding the key concepts of ensuring security and trust through compliance to regulations and standards. So we'll see how we can use compliance to build security and trust within our organizations. Now, to start with, let's look at what exactly is cybersecurity compliance management. This is about a process of running our organization in compliance with or in line with the laws, the regulations, and the industry standards that apply to our organization. Now, why is this all important? Because compliance management ensures that we are running our business or organization in a legal and ethical way. What does it do? It helps us build trust with our employees, with our customers, and with the people that we work with. Now, let's look at some of the key terms, because these would be the terms that we will use and hear and talk about a lot when we talk about and learn about the world of compliance management. So the first one being law. What is a law? These are basically the broad principles and mandates that are issued by the ruler of a particular country or a particular geography. Now, depending on the country you are watching this from, you could have a central government law or you may have a state government law, depending on the style of the ruler, or you may have it from your king or the queen. Yeah. Now, the next key term is regulation. What is a regulation? Regulations are basically detailed rules that the government agencies, like ministries, the departments, they issue to specify how to implement the laws, or how can we enforce the laws? What should we do so that we are in compliance with the law? And the final is the industry standard. The industry standard is nothing but basically established norms or working models, reference models that apply only to a specific industry. And it gives us those uniform criteria, methods, processes that you expect so that we run a particular industry in an ethical and legal way, right? And why did the industry standards come into play? Because they usually are created by either a standard organization or a consortium of leading organizations within a particular industry, so that they can run the industry in a proper manner. Now that we have looked at key terms, let's dive a little bit about where we stand in terms of the laws, regulations, and industry standards globally, and some examples of what they are. Now, on the screen here, you would see there's a small example I've taken from United Nations website. And although the stats are from 2021, and I will share it as and when they publish the more latest statistics. But for now, let's look. As of December 2021, we had 81% of the countries, of the 194 member countries, had e-transaction laws. Some 59% of them had consumer protection laws. We had 71% of countries with privacy laws. and it is increasing. The privacy is an area where we are seeing a lot of regulatory changes happening now across the globe. And as of 2021, 80% of the countries had cybercrime laws. Now, these are the different laws, and the reason I'm sharing about all of these laws and regulations is because in one way or the other, these laws impact the what and the hows of the cybersecurity industry as well. So it will drive and help us define what is it that we expect so that we are compliant to all of these different laws and regulations. Yeah. Now, when we talk about global regulations, some of the more famous ones are the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, different countries, the European Union has one version, the UK has a slightly different uh, version to it, yeah, flavor to it. But a lot of the different countries have got them. America has a few different data protection regulations, but they vary by the state. The other example is HIPAA, which is more applicable to the health insurance industry or the health industry. Now, talking about industry standards, yeah, you would have heard some of the common examples like ISO 27001. You have the NIST, the cybersecurity framework. Then you've got the PCI DSS, which is applicable more for the payment industry. So between all of this, these are some examples of the laws, regulations, and industry standards that we all work through, depending on where we are and where our organizations are. Now, that's about the laws, regulations. Let's dive into compliance. Now, just like governance and risk management, we also want to make sure that there is a structured approach for compliance management. Yeah. Now, what does this process looks like? It has 5 stages. So we start with identifying the compliance requirements. Then we move on to defining how do we meet those compliance requirements. Then we will go towards, once we have defined, we go to implementing those defined controls. Let's call it that. Yeah. Once you have implemented, and because we have to implement a more sustainable compliance management process, we have to bake in a monitoring stage. What we do in that is we will monitor whether or not we are doing the right things to make sure that we are meeting the compliance. Now, as part of the monitoring, once we identify where our gaps or room for improvement are, we will send it up as a feedback loop in the update stage. The update stage will basically define these are the changes we would need to do, or this is what it needs to happen. Now, the update process is quite interesting because although in the diagram it looks like a cyclical process, but the update stage can actually trigger or impact or influence any of the different stages, the first, second, and third. So it could say that, oh, you had not identified this requirement. Oh, you had not defined or you need to improve upon this particular control. It could also influence how we are implementing a particular control to meet requirements, or are we not doing it the right way? So the update stage is quite interesting from that perspective, but essentially the compliance management process has 5 key stages there. Now let's look at the stage 1, where we identify compliance requirements. Why is it important? Because obviously we need to understand what are the requirements in the first place before we start doing anything, right? How do we do that? So there's 2 stages. First is we interpret and understand the requirements. Now, my personal best practice for this is that we form a working group where we bring in experts from the legal team, the IT teams, and cybersecurity teams so that we can understand and not assume. This is very, very important in compliance, that we should not assume that this is what the law means or this is what it is. And hence the very, very important role that the legal team plays, because they are the experts who understand the legal world a lot better than us, who are not lawyers. So it would be a smart thing to do to involve the legal team so that you understand and interpret the law in the right way. So once you have understood this, the next stage is going to be conducting a gap analysis. Why? Because once we know what we need to achieve, we need to also understand where do we stand today. Maybe we are really bad, or maybe we are really good. Maybe there's a lot to be done. Maybe there's not enough to be done. So two stages or two things that you need to make sure that is covered in the identification stage. Now, once you have identified the requirements and the gap or where current state, we need to then define what needs to be put in place. Now, this can come in a lot of different forms and different forms, let's call it that, yeah. It could be a policy, it could be a process, it could be user communication and awareness, it could be about implementing a specific technical control, or it could be around how do you define the risk management specifics or governance specifics, right? Now, at this point, I want us to go a little bit into what we learned in week 1 around the dependencies or interdependencies between the governance, risk management, and compliance. Yeah. So in this diagram, we had talked about and learned that there is a lot of interdependency and connection between the three different sub-functions within governance, risk management, and compliance. So in this, we had talked about in week 1 how compliance kind of influences both the governance and the risk management functions and what needs to happen. So that's kind of where this piece comes to life during the definition stage of compliance management. And this is where it is very, very important that the compliance team is very well connected and continually speaking to and communicating to the governance and the risk management teams. Yeah. Now, that we have defined, let's look at what do we do and how do we really go about implementing the compliance. Yeah. Now we talked about that we can achieve compliance or by a lot of different ways. We can do that by defining a policy, a process. Yeah. Now during implementation, we will actually go and communicate it to the users, set expectations, and make sure that we are developing and enforcing those mechanisms that we have defined in the previous stage. Yeah. Now, if it is policy and process, then a lot comes into user awareness and the training. Yeah. Where it comes to technical controls, it may mean that working very closely with your IT teams or with your vendors who may be operating those technical controls, or maybe you need to procure some additional controls. Yeah. A very critical part of implementing compliance is that we have to embed compliance within the risk management and governance processes, risk management practices, as well as governance. Yeah. So remember, we talked about the interdependencies. So embedding compliance requirements is going to be very good, important, and the smart thing to do. And obviously, we talked about that as we do all of that, we need to make sure that we are constantly communicating with our stakeholders. Let's look at some examples of around implementing compliance. Now, a hospital might be implementing HIPAA compliant controls, which means so HIPAA gives us a list of controls that it expects the healthcare provider to implement. So a hospital might be implementing that. An e-commerce company might be implementing, let's say, PCI DSS, yeah, because it is handling payment. A marketing agency might need to be compliant to GDPR as well as ISO 27001. Now, this example is quite unique that there's a compliance requirement from a government perspective, the GDPR. But here in this case, in this example of marketing agency, their customer is also expecting them to be compliant to this industry standard of ISO 27001. Yeah. Why? Because the customers are seeking assurance that this marketing agency is handling the data in a secure manner. Yeah. And they have a resilient culture internally. So that gives us gives the customers a bit more assurance that this is the right people to work with. Now comes the interesting part, right? Now, as the regulations are increasing, as the industry standards are increasing, right? The load on compliance management is also increasing. But how do we really make it efficient? Yeah. If we are running after, like some of the big companies like the Googles and the Microsofts and Amazons of the world, they have to actually be compliant with tens and tens of regulations, right? But if they have to spend time on each one of them, it's going to be super expensive and not efficient at all. So a smart way of doing that is to adopt a common controls framework. Now we'll look at and we'll do some hands-on exercise of how to go about defining that in week 8 and 9. But for now, I wanted to introduce this concept here on this session called Common Controls Framework. What is it? It's basically nothing but you apply a control once, but you meet the compliance requirements of many different regulations or industry standards. A good example, a simple example is access controls. Yeah, we all know that restricting access to authorized people is one of the fundamental controls within cybersecurity. Yeah, you should only give people who on a need to know or have basis. Yeah. Now, access control is a requirement in GDPR, in ISO 27001, in HIPAA, in PCI DSS. So just imagine if you do access control correctly, how many requirements are you meeting? 4, 5, maybe 6. Yeah. So that's where we need to have a good grasp of our regulatory requirements or our compliance requirements so that we are not running like headless chicken, but we are actually thinking and absorbing like how can we do this more smartly? How can we achieve more by doing less? That should be our goal of working smart work, right? And common controls framework is the way to go in implementing a smart compliance. Now we have implemented, yeah? Let's move on to monitoring. Why? Because we need to have a sustainable compliance management as well. And how can we do that? How do we know if we are doing the right thing or not? And where is our room for improvement? We do that by monitoring what we are doing. Now, monitoring can happen using various different methods. Now, the 3 common ones that we do and can be or should be implemented is compliance assurance checks. This is usually carried out by the cybersecurity team. Now, what are these? These assurance checks is basically nothing but the cybersecurity team, as they have defined the expectations and they have asked and communicated the stakeholders that this is what we expect you to do. So from time to time, they would go and do some checks and review. Yeah, just to make sure whether the people are doing the right things. Are they acting and behaving in an expected manner? So that's compliance assurance checks. Now, the next piece is internal audit. Now, internal audit is basically an internal but independent party which will give us or give the senior management an independent feedback or view if and how good or bad the compliance management program is within the organization. Yeah. Now, the third party that we have here or third mechanism is external audits. Why is external audit important? Because historically, sometimes it has been seen that the management could impact what has been reported by their internal teams. And that's why where it is important, especially as the organizations grow bigger or if they operate in a very regulated industry like the banking and financial, they would have they will have to go through external audits just to make sure that they are indeed compliant to the requirements and they are not just saying it for the sake of saying. Yeah. So you see how these 3 different mechanisms play a vital role in monitoring that the compliance management program is doing the right thing that it should do. Yeah. The compliance assurance check is a lot more close to the operations. Yeah. And a lot more hands-on. The internal audit usually runs in a calendar, an annual calendar, but depending on where your program is, you could have more than once in a year. The external audits could happen every year, or it could happen every few years, depending on the industry and depending on the regulatory requirements, yeah, or the compliance requirements. So between all of this, we can continuously monitor where we stand from a compliance perspective. Now, we learned that the monitoring stage gives us a view of where we are going good and where we need to improve, right? So what do we do with that information? We are collecting all of that to make sure that our compliance program is up to date, yeah? And we are making improvements as we go along. Now, how do we do that? To do that, there are 5 key elements there. The first is we have to make sure that we have roles and responsibilities defined. Now, we also talked about roles and responsibilities in the governance section. Yes, that was week 2. In governance, we also talked about roles and responsibilities. So it's equally important in compliance to know who is responsible for what. Because compliance is so integral and so critical for an organization, we need to make sure there's a named individual who is assigned as a compliance officer. Now, depending on the size and industry and all of that other factors, you may have just one person or you may have a team. Yeah. And in some organizations where they are just starting off their compliance program, they sometimes have someone with the double hat of a compliance officer as well. But whatever the mechanism you do or however you do it, it's important there's someone accountable for compliance. Yeah. Then we have to regularly update, give the feedback to the governance function so that the policies and processes are kept updated, right? And the controls as well. Very important. While as we do this, we have to keep the organization culture in our foremind. Why? Because once we have embedded risk and compliance management into the culture, everything that we do becomes a lot easier. Although building the culture is not easy in itself, yeah, because obviously that's not the main job that we have hired all the different people for, but it will take time. But we have to keep constantly talking to our stakeholders so that in time we build that culture of compliance and risk management. And finally, I come to the efficiency element. To make sure that our compliance is up to date, it has to be efficient. Yeah. So where possible, try to automate things. Yeah. Now, whether we use this using simple tools like Excel sheets or using complex GRC solutions or applications, or we use tools like Power BI for reporting. Yeah. So those kind of things. So we can do a lot of things, but we have to make sure that we are leveraging technology where possible to bring in and increase the efficiency in the overall compliance management. Now, we talked about the 5 phases, yeah. But saying it is one thing, but achieving that is not easy. Like with everything, it has its own challenges. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about the challenges, right? Now, in 2024, now that we stand here, one of the biggest challenges of compliance management is to actually be aware of all the very, very rapidly evolving regulations. Just in the sort of last 2 to 3 years, there have been so many different regulations that have come through and come over. For example, just in the last year, we have seen so many regulations being updated around privacy. So many new AI regulations have come. So many new countries have now have more cybercrime laws. So there's a lot happening there, and ISO standards are changing. So that in itself is a big challenge. How do we keep ourselves updated with it? Yeah. And then the other piece is that the target of compliance or objective is to make sure that we are running the business operations in a legal and ethical way, right? Now, business in itself or an organization has its target. So balancing the two can be a challenge, especially when it's a fast moving industry. It can be quite the challenge, or if you have very, very steep revenue targets, yeah, then managing all the 10 different compliance can slow down the process a lot and impact the pace of the overall business operations. We also call it red tape. But what we need to understand is the way to overcome this is to make our compliance processes efficient. And that's where your common control framework or your automation or great understanding of the interconnects of the processes will really help. Yeah. And like with any other business process, comes the resource constraints. Now, it could be money or the budget, it could be just the available time, it could be around the expertise that's available. Yeah. For example, some regulations require us to achieve compliance by a certain date. But what if we don't have the budget or the expertise to meet that timeline? Yeah. So we can have a lot of those challenges. And because of the fast evolving regulatory landscape, making sure that we have the right expertise in the team or we know someone outside who has the right expertise is quite a challenge in itself. Because yes, there are a lot of people who may claim, but how do we trust that? That's kind of where the solution lies. Yeah, so it's very important to make sure that you have the right people in the team and also outside from a council perspective. So that's challenge, but how do we really kind of go about solving them? So I touched a little bit about the tools as I was talking through the challenges, but let's look at that. Look at the 4 key tools that we need to make sure that we are baking in as we are building our compliance management program. Yeah. So the first one is, our first challenge was what? To keep ourselves aware of the changing requirements, right? So how can we do that? We can do that by subscribing to the different materials. It could be website, newsletters, or just making sure that your official email ID is with the regulator, those of who like to send email notifications or issue formal letters about the changes that's happening on the regulations and laws. So we have to make sure that there's an official subscription so that we can understand these requirements. Yeah. From an organization perspective. From your personal perspective, there are a lot of organizations who issue from time to time issue newsletters, or you can also subscribe to certain websites. You can make depending on the country you are, and once you understand who your regulator is for a particular organization, you could bookmark their websites and keep visiting them time to time, or just subscribe for a notification when something changes. The next tool is interesting, is around tracking and reporting, right? So just how last week we talked about maintaining a risk register, similarly in the compliance management world, you need to have a compliance register, right? Now this can be again either an Excel sheet or a few Excel sheets, or it can be a complex application, a GRC application or a tool, or it could be a mix of various tools. Yeah. You may have an intranet for that, or you may have your own internal kind of management meeting forums and stuff like that for tracking and reporting purposes. The next one is actually a technical control, but it's one of my favorites because it brings a lot of efficiency into the process. And because we are specifically focused on and talking about cybersecurity compliance, one of the key components is to go back and review the technical configuration of our solutions, right? Now, obviously, as the digital footprints grow. It's already exploded and it's growing more. Yeah. Now, as it goes through, it is humanly very difficult, if not impossible, to go and review all of these configurations from time to time using the same amount of resources, right? So that's going to be a killer for and too much to manage manually. So that's where the automated configuration checking tools come in handy. Yeah, you can just search for all the different tools that's available in the market and see what is effective for you. The cloud providers, they have or at least most of them have a way of checking that automatically. For the on-premise, there are different industry tools that's available. Now, the last but not the least, my personal favorite is the assurance calendar. If you are already working in compliance and you don't have an assurance calendar, then please use this as an opportunity to put that together. If you are new to compliance management, then let me explain what this is. So assurance calendar is nothing but is basically a schedule of all the different assurance activities you need to do throughout the calendar year. For example, you may need to do configuration checks. You may need to go check the policy compliance. You may need to go check ISO 27001 compliance and things like that. Yeah. But if you're doing it without a plan, then it's going to be really, really difficult for us to, or for anyone to kind of plan through the resources, right? Because when you're doing assurance checks, you need a certain number of resources. You need responses from the business users, responses from the department users, depending on where you are. So without a plan, it's going to be very difficult to coordinate all of that activity. But if you have a plan and it is published, yeah, then you can let your stakeholders know in advance that this is what you expect from an assurance perspective. This is when we are going to come and ask you about all these different things. How are you doing with your compliance? Yeah. So, like I said, if you're watching this and if you are already in compliance management or have responsibility for compliance, please take this time to build a assurance calendar for the next year or the next period that comes closest. If you're new to compliance management, start with in an Excel sheet, put January to December and note down the activities that will need to be taken. And we'll take an example and build a compliance assurance calendar in week 8 and 9. Yeah, but for now, I wanted to introduce you to the concept. So that brings us to the end of week 4. And I can't believe it's already end of week 4. Oh my God. Thank you so much for staying with me for week 4. Let's do a quick summary here. Compliance, why is it important? Because it helps us protect data. It helps us be secure. It helps us avoid penalties and building trust and resilience. We talked about the fact that effective compliance management, it requires a structured approach, just like governance and risk management, and all the way from identifying the requirements to auditing or monitoring the compliance requirements. Yeah. And definitely, we have to say that we have to remain proactive and constantly evolve as the requirements evolve. Because remember, the main goal of GRC is to make the organization sustainable and resilient. So now if the governance, risk management, and compliance processes are not forward-looking, sustainable in themselves, then it's going to be very, very difficult to pass that resilience and structure to the organization in itself. So that's kind of where we bring the introduction section to an end here with the week 4. Next week onwards, now it gets a lot more interesting, lot more heavy, lot more cyber heavy, because now the last 4 weeks, we talked about and we got introduced to the concepts. But starting next week, we'll look at the different cybersecurity control domains. Why? Because then we'll take those and we'll start using that as we start week 6 and going into the field action. Because without knowing what control domains exist, is going to be very difficult for you to make a good impact there. So with that, I would say thank you so much for staying with me. And I hope you like these 4 weeks and will stay with me for the next up to 12 weeks. And again, as a quick reminder, if you have not already subscribed, please take the moment to subscribe now. And if you have got any questions, you know where to find me. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can put it in the comments of the video itself. For now, this is Priyanka saying bye-bye.